Everybody hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Good. Good to see everybody this morning. My trusty whiteboard. Does anybody want me to put this giant timeline back on here with 1,000 points on it and all that stuff? Maybe we'll give that a break this morning. Jason, guys, thank you. Bill, thank you. I was thinking while Phil was talking, probably a year and a half, 2 years ago, I don't know what I was doing, just something trivial, and the Lord just spoke to me out of nowhere, and He said, you have this terrible understanding of who the Father is in the Old Testament. Just out of the blue, He says that to me. And I'm like, what do you mean? He said, you see me in the Old Testament as a harsh judge. And, I'll be honest, it's what it looks like. It really is what it looks like when you read it. And I said, okay, what do I do about that? And He said, I want you to go back. I want you to read through the stories where you see that, where you see me that way. And instead of looking for judgment, I want you to look for mercy. So I immediately had 2 or 3 places that, I immediately thought of where that appears. And so I went back and I reread those stories. And as I read, I really tried to look for mercy. And to be honest, it wasn't hard because it jumped off the page of just how merciful He really was in all these places where He appeared in the past to me to be so harsh and so hard. And I just thought, wow, how did I miss that? How does everybody I know miss that? And you can remember when I first started using the whiteboard and teaching here, I put this word up here and it was eisegesis, which basically meant that you read onto the text what you already think. And because I had already been preconditioned by every sermon I'd ever heard and every children's Bible book and everything else about the severity and the judgment of God, I could not read those stories and not put that onto what I was reading until He told me, don't do that. Actually look for my mercy. And the entire scriptures actually changed for me on that day, because I cannot look at the scripture anymore and look for the harsh judge and look for the judgment and the wrath and the anger of God. And I'm not discounting that there are scriptures that talk about some of these things, but I now understand I didn't have a clue what He's talking about when He talked about these things. So this is not what I plan to talk about this morning, but maybe I'll get to that later. I don't know how you guys feel, but I'm like super emotional. I know, Phil, you're with me, but I'm just super emotional for some reason this morning, which is very hard to be a teacher and be emotional. So maybe I won't be a teacher this morning. I'll wear a different hat. But I began to think about the Father and how I portray Him that way. And I'll tell you a little story. There's a very prominent theologian that I like to read, and he's controversial because he's not afraid to tackle the hard stuff. But I was actually listening to a podcast where he was talking about this in his life and how that, and I'll probably get back to this more later, but basically the Lord kind of came and did the same thing to him. And it wrecked his whole world because his entire theology, even his master's dissertation Everything he had built his ministry on, and years of preaching and teaching, had been based on that thinking about the severity of God. And the Lord told him, stop. That's not me. And he didn't want to hear that because it ruined his whole life. It ruined everything he had ever built. So he wasn't a guy who was trying to change his theology. He's a guy who God wrecked his theology because it wasn't him. And so I understand. I get what he's feeling and what he was saying, because I've been down that road, maybe not as severe as he was, but the Lord intervened one day and said, you got to change how you see this, because you don't know who I am. And so I want to share that little tidbit with you. We really don't know who he is. And I hate to say that to people, because I know we have a relationship, and I know the Lord is good to us, and we've had encounters with the Lord, and he's changed our lives, and we know him. He saved us and all that good stuff. But do we know who he is? Really? Autumn and I thank you, all you guys from Pennsylvania, for coming this morning, by the way. Autumn and I were sitting at the kitchen table yesterday, and we had a 2 or 3 hour discussion. We were just talking about the Lord and scriptures and different ideas and things, and having a good time. And I noticed something. We talked about the wrath and severity of God in this context, and it was just our conversation, and it was intellectual, and it was stimulating, because we were digging and we were talking about stuff. But when we turned that and started talking about his goodness, he came in the room. We both started like, wow, man. You feel that? Yeah, I feel that. It's amazing how when we start talking about his true character and nature, he can't help but show up. He can't help but walk in the room and be a part of what you're doing, because you're actually releasing his character and his nature into the atmosphere. And he's like, I'll show up where 2 of you are gathered together. Yeah. And you really want to talk about who I am? I'll come and I will testify to you who I am. And it was good. We could have stayed there all day and not done anything else as far as I'm concerned, because when he's in the room, I don't care what else is going on. Right? So when Neil called me, or texted me, or whatever he did, I think he texted me last week, and he's like, going to be gone today. He said, would you want to do this? And I'm like, yeah, I will. And I said, but this is what I'm going to talk about. And he said, good, have fun. So if you don't like what I'm going to talk about today, blame it on him. It's his fault. He said it's okay. So hopefully I'm segueing into what I actually plan to talk about. I'm not going to write a whole lot on here today, hopefully, but this is a very important word. Yeah. We all know this word, right? Atonement. We've all heard it. If you've been in church and you've heard a few sermons, you had to hear this word. So let's talk about this word. In Hebrew, this word will actually mean to cover. So that's how they would use this word. And it's horrible English to take a word and break it into parts and say, oh yeah, that's how it came to be. But it actually works for this word. It literally means atonement. That is the origin. That's how the word came into being, because it wasn't a word. And they created the word atonement because they had to find a way to talk about atonement. And so the original definition of this word would have been, let me make sure I say this correctly. Simply, I thought so. Reconcile. It describes this process of being reconciled. So that's pretty simple. I think we should all be able to take that and run with it, right? the problem is, like, the Eastern Church really has an issue with this English word because they have watched over the centuries this word change. The meaning of it changed to us. The actual meaning hasn't changed, but the meaning, what we think it means, has changed. And now it has come to be more synonymous with a payment. And it was not intended to be that way. It's about reconciliation, not payment. And so the Eastern Church would kind of shun the word atonement, the English word atonement. They would have, I'm sure, some Greek word or whatever for it. But it's important. So I want to say this in the outset. Atonement has many theories. But atonement theories are not the gospel. And the problem that we've had in the church for a long time, for several hundred years, maybe even 500 or more, is that our atonement theory has actually become our gospel message. Atonement theory is nothing but describing what happened at the cross and the resurrection. That's it. How did things progress? How did it take place? What transpired, I guess is a better way to say it. That's our atonement theory. And it's theory because we don't agree on it. If we all agreed, we could just say that's what atonement means. But now we don't agree, so we have to put theories out there for what it means. But that is not the gospel. Our atonement theory is not the gospel. And I promise you, you could go to most churches and say, hey, what's the gospel? And they would give you their atonement theory. It's just how it works. It's how we think, especially in the West. Okay? So let me just go ahead and blow that up. You see, the good news, which is what the gospel means, it involves the atonement. But I actually wrote this down so that I wouldn't mess it up this morning. So let me read it to you. The good news is that we were never separated from the Father except in our mind. And He came in human form to enter our darkness and depravity and to take that on Himself, to enter death and Hades and conquer both while taking the keys forever. Thereby we never have to feel lost or separated from our Father ever again. And no theory of atonement can replace the good news, which is it's done.
Yeah.
Okay? He has done it, and all your theories are nothing more than theories because His work is done.
Yeah.
And He conquered it, He took the keys, and they are not going to be released again. So that is a little different than, well, I think this happened and He might have been doing that. That's not the gospel. That cannot replace the good news. However, so why is this important? Why do I want to talk about it this morning? Well, here's the thing. Throughout history, our understanding of the whys that surround the crucifixion, the resurrection, the ascension, has really dictated to us our understanding of the Father. So how the why of this, okay, determines how I see, how I think about the Father, how I think about Jesus. Is that important? Well, yeah, I think so. Because how we interact with Him is directly related to what took place on the cross. Even just recently, another guy and I, this guy's really, really into this stuff, and so he and I were having this discussion about atonement, and he does a podcast, and he has like some real high level, very intelligent guys on there talking, and so we were kind of picking each other's brain about atonement, how the Lord had been teaching us different things. So we're just having a good conversation amongst ourselves, and we're both kind of getting worked up because we like this thing and we're excited about what we're learning. And then so there's a pastor sitting across the room, because it was a whole room full of pastors, but people were kind of having their own conversations. And so this pastor's sitting across the room, and he's listening to us, and he turns to another pastor who's a friend of mine, and he says, the reason I know this is because the other pastor came and told me, he says, what does any of this have to do with how I tell people about Jesus? Very condescending to our private conversation that he was listening into. That's fine. He doesn't have to think it's important. But I thought about that for a while. What does that have to do with anything? So I just wrote this down. It really matters. It really does matter. Because without understanding this topic, we have almost no perspective of what Jesus actually did for us on the cross or in the resurrection. We just have a Bible story. Our introduction of people to Jesus is actually tainted because we don't understand what happened. So therefore, we can't accurately give them the picture of who Jesus is and who the Father is, because we've never discovered that. And so everything we talk about is skewed, and the spiritual growth and the level of intimacy of the people that we teach and disciple is going to suffer because we don't properly understand what He actually did for us. So does that matter? I think so. It matters to me. This was a monumental moment in time that we have built a little theory around and just said, okay, yeah, that's good, let's move on. And I think that's crazy. How can we not discuss this? How can we not settle this in our own minds to understand what He did? Why did He do it? What was God's motivation for this thing, and what actually took place? I think if we don't settle this thing, we're never going to have a proper understanding and relationship with the Lord, because we're always going to have a tainted view of who He is. Is that fair enough to say? It's my opinion, so I guess it's okay. But if we don't do this, if we don't learn these things, then we're going to keep going around the same circles. And I don't know about you, but I'm tired of going around the religious circles. So there's 4 main theories of atonement. 4. I won't fully discuss some of them, but number 1 is called, you've heard Neil say this many times, Christus Victor. Anybody want to expound on that? Christus Victor. Christ victorious. Okay? Here's a short synopsis of what that means. Jesus' death and resurrection results in Satan being defeated and humanity ransomed and set free from his bondage. Jesus was the victor. Part of that is that we owed a debt we couldn't pay. God actually paid the enemy because we'd given ourselves over to Him, and He bought us back. And most of the church for the first 1,000 years, actually pretty much the entire church, for the first 1,000 years, believed Christus Victor. So it was good enough for a millennium of the church. And, there's going to be varying little things people disagreed on, but the foundation, Christ victorious, He paid for us, bought us back, and the enemy was forever defeated, was the foundational doctrine of the church, or atonement theory of the church, for 1,000 years. So, number 2 comes along. It's called satisfaction. Okay? A guy named Anselm, one of the revered fathers of the church from the Middle Ages. He lived from 1033 to 1109, just in case you're interested. At least you know the time frame of this. And he argued against Jesus' life being given as a ransom, because he did not believe God should have to pay Satan for anything.
Amen.
Man had dishonored God. You got to understand, the man lives in a feudal system, right? We're lords over regions, and everybody else works for them. And so if you insulted someone, then your Lord, or someone insulted you, your Lord had to punish them. He was your protector, your Lord. And so that this feudal system is how they thought And so he says that man had dishonored God and so owed an incredible debt to the Lord that he could not pay. So God came and paid it for him. That became the predominant view in the late Middle Ages. This really took root in the 1200s and began to be the predominant thinking in the church. So the 1,000 years of understanding Christ victorious starts to give way to the satisfaction. The debt was paid for your ransom, but it wasn't paid to the enemy. It was paid to God. So it just basically changed who got paid. But it also changed how they thought. So then, number 3. Penal substitutionary atonement. $1500s. A guy named Calvin comes along. He buys in to all the teachings of Augustine from the 400s that we talked about in the first session, and about how totally depraved man was, and that we were totally worthless, and that even into the double predestination and all that stuff, and he builds on it and makes his entire theology, his entire gospel, built on this penal substitutionary atonement. So what this means, it comes out of the Protestant Reformation. John Calvin was a lawyer, he was not a theologian, so he's a lawyer, and society was built on law and punishment. There was law, and there was, if you break the law, there was judgment. And so, in his mind, this is how the gospel worked. And his bottom line was God was a judge, and a judge must punish sin. And so, Jesus was our substitute, taking the punishment for us as lawbreakers. And that became the predominant atonement theory throughout the world, completely annihilating the Christian victor and most of the part of the satisfaction it pulls into it. And so the bottom line is this became not the only theory, but the predominant theory in the world, and still is today. So now there's a fourth atonement theory that we're going to talk about. Sure that I spelled that correctly. I did. Covenantal atonement. And what does that simply mean is that God will make a new covenant and he will forgive sins. And so now, I just wanted you to know what those 4 were, and I'm going to take them down. And I'm only going to focus on 2 of them. We're going to start with the penal substitutionary atonement, heretofore known as the PSA. But I'm tired of saying it. And especially tired of writing it. Okay. Penal substitutionary atonement has 3 basic premises. God is just. We all agree with that, right? Yes. Well, because God is just, he must punish sin. Make sure I get this exactly correct. In the right order. Yep. And so Jesus took our punishment. Anybody raised that way?
Yeah.
Okay. Me too. I talked about this a little in the very first session about the timeline. So this is, even churches who will not say that they're Calvinists still teach this. It is really become the foundation of our teaching. So, I want to read you a couple things. Anybody ever heard of R.C. Sproul?
Yeah.
Most of us at some point in time. Very, very well-known theologian, preacher, whatever. These are his words. Christ did his work on the cross to placate the wrath of God This idea of placating the wrath of God has done little to placate the wrath of modern theologians. In fact, they become very wrathful about the whole idea of placating God's wrath. They think it is beneath the dignity of God to have to be placated, that we should have to do something to soothe or appease him. We need to be very careful in how we understand the wrath of God. But let me remind you that the concept of placating the wrath of God has to do here not with the peripheral, tangential point of theology, but with the essence of salvation. So the essence of our salvation is based in the wrath of God, according to him. Then he says, Jesus is our asbestos suit against the white-hot wrath of God against sinners. So, I did this before, but I'll do it again. We have the cross. We have God. His white-hot wrath pouring out. And us fortunate little ones here, protected from the wrath of God by Jesus. That is their gospel. That is their atonement theory, and that is how everything works. And you're only in this if God chose you to be in it. Okay? And so, if you're out here, then God's wrath is radiated against you at all times. And they even go so far as to say that at the final judgment, then God's unrestrained wrath is going to be coming against you. That's scary. So here's a blogger. This guy's kind of popular on the internet. He says, sin demands justice. Justice demands punishment. And punishment is made visible in wrath. A holy God is a just God. A God who judges right from wrong. When he judges something to be wrong, he must punish it. And the punishment is expressed in wrath. That's pretty heavy, isn't it? God's wrath is a holy wrath that is expressed against sin, which is to say, against sinners. That white-hot hatred of sin will be expressed against those who have defied God. Because the sinner has sinned consciously, he must face this punishment consciously. What is the right length of punishment for a crime of this magnitude? A month of facing God's wrath? A year? 20 years? Because of the eternal distance between God and the human sinner, he has committed an infinite eternal offense and must face this punishment eternally. For to come up with a sentence less than eternal would be to say that he is less than eternal. The eternality of the punishment is simply a realistic assessment of the never-ending vastness of the difference between us and God. Thus, the just sentence for sinning against this holy, holy, holy God is to be judged guilty and eternally, consciously facing the wrath of God against sin. Shoot. So you remember, we had this guy, Plato, right? And he said, God, whatever he is up here in the spirit realm, and man is down here in the natural realm, and there's this vast separation between us, right? And then we had his protege come along, Aristotle, and he's saying not only the same thing here, but that God is timeless and he cannot change. And then, about 500 years later, or 600 years later, we have the Neoplatonists come along, and Plotinus says not only is the spirit realm untouchable and the place where God is, there's a vast separation between us, and we can never interact with that. And God is so holy that he can never interact with this world. And so all he does is radiates his wrath and his will and his love, and everything else radiates from him. And because he is timeless and because he cannot be changed, he is just, and by nature his wrath will punish sin, and that cannot be avoided. Does that sound familiar? Guess what? The guy who came up with this studied this when he was younger. We talked about it earlier. And yet, 600 years later, they bring it back up. And 200 years after Plotinus was gone, they're still bringing it back up. And it's about 1,200 years later, Calvin brings it back in and says, this is the gospel. This is the God, the white-hot wrath of God radiating against everything sin, and therefore sinners, and everything revolves around God's wrath. That's just heavy. So God is angry at sin, and his anger is directed towards sinners. I wouldn't want to be one, would you? So because Jesus is so good, he places himself on the cross and protects us from an angry, wrathful God. And the sad thing about it is, when I say this, it's my first thought, and probably other people's, is, who actually believes that? That God is that bad, and that Jesus, if I say Jesus saved you from what? You're going to say hell, death, sickness, whatever comes to mind. How many of you say Jesus saved me from God? But that is what this says. Exactly. So he saved me from himself? How does this work? Okay. So in this atonement theory, God's wrath is still directed towards all who do not believe in Jesus and will be fully released, as I said, on the day of judgment. Jesus is the wall between the wrath of God and Christians. So fortunate for us, Jesus actually loves us. So the foundations for this was laid by the Greek philosophers. God is holy and immovable, and he must be appeased. So, this same guy I was talking about, that the Lord came and said to him, stop telling people that I was punishing my son on the cross, which he actually did his master's dissertation on. He said he goes to a bunch of different theologians from all different streams. He didn't want to just get one denomination or one whatever opinion. He went to 19, I think, different places, different theologians, and said, okay, this is what the Lord's saying to me. It's wrecked everything I've ever taught and ever believed. Explain to me what you see. And so all these people responded to him and gave him what they saw and why they thought what the Lord was saying was right and why he had been wrong. So he goes to this Greek Orthodox archbishop, and he's talking to him, and he says,